Treyarch's Spider-Man 2 movie licensed video game was something of a landmark title, if not for the industry, then at least for the Spider-Man franchise. One of, if not the first superhero open-world game, it was the first Spider-Man game that took the character's iconic web-swinging and made it a core fleshed-out gameplay mechanic instead of a weak flying or finicky jumping command. A completely new and innovative movement and traversal system that not only gave a nearly unprecedented level of freedom in perfectly mimicking an iconic hero for an immersive experience like no other, it took a very basic grind in most open world games and transformed it into something to experiment with and master. Yeah, the missions were straightforward, the plot was nothing spectacular, the combat was unrefined, and the physics could go really screwy, but by and large the game tried something so new and daring and nailed it so perfectly that it more than made up for everything else. There's a reason this now 17-year-old game is still a benchmark by which other superhero titles are measured, and it's because Spider-Man 2, the movie licensed game, is an all-time spectacular release. That is, unless you played it on the PC. See, Treyarch didn't have anything to do with the PC version of the game. Instead, recently unmasked serial rapist and mass sex abuser Activision farmed the PC version out to the Fizz Factor, an offshoot branch of Image Entertainment that had only made a point-and-click game of Spirit the Cartoon Horse before being handed one of the biggest licenses in existence. So I think I speak for everyone who's requested this game when I say, oh no! The game begins with a cutscene of Peter attending Dr. Otto Octavius' demonstration of his new fusion reactor, where, like in the movie, the reactor goes berserk, fries Otto's robotic arms, they kind of leave out Otto's wife being killed despite it being crucial to his character, and Spider-Man has to stop it. This is weird because the console version waits a few hours before getting to the origin of Dr. Octopus so they can properly introduce all the characters, build Peter's relationships, establish a connection to the villain to build emotional investment for that whole tragic villain deal, set up some of the other villains, just generally lay all the groundwork out to tell an actual friggin' story. But sure, let's just skip over the entire first act with zero context. That works too. So Spider-Man swings to the rescue to face down the reactor and immediately cut to Spider-Man running down the street. What? So Spider-Man saw this runaway reactor threatening to level the entire city and kill millions at bare minimum, and he just left.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Whatever, now it's time for the tutorial and the best part of all these movie games, Bruce Campbell's narration taking the piss out of the game and out of you for playing it.
All right, listen up, Fancy Pants. Let's run through the basics just in case you're not that bright. Let's see you pummel 'em senseless. It'll be cool and funny. Adventure awaits. In a loose sense.
You know the console version credits him as tour guide? Bruce Campbell had to record 2 different sets of directions for 2 different games. I'd love it if he slipped in, dude, you totally got screwed buying this on PC. So you know how the main version of Spider-Man 2 forever shaped the history of the franchise with its utterly brilliant web-swinging system? Yeah, well, too bad. In this version, Spider-Man can only swing from pre-placed and really specific swing points sporadically placed along the buildings, and you have to specifically aim your camera and cursor at a point in order to swing from it. Well, I guess that makes sense. Logically, Spider-Man would have the easiest time web-swinging from outcroppings and poles that stick out past the faces of the buildings. He doesn't, though. You swing from arbitrary points of empty air a few feet out from the buildings. This web-swinging system is slow, it's boring, there are so few swing points that it has extremely little actual interactivity, and it takes the exhilarating freedom of the console game and takes it out behind a woodshed with a shotgun. I get the logic in forcing you to manually aim every swing to replicate Spider-Man's powers, but when people say they want to feel like a superhero, they don't mean replicating the tedious minutiae of their powers. There's no part in the Batman game where you have to stop and untangle all the knots out of its grappling hooks. But I digress. What else do they cover in this tutorial? You can climb walls with slow movement speed and a camera that's rigged to stare squarely at the wall and can't look out so you can't see what you're doing. You can web zip to walls by pointing the cursor at them. It's a total crapshoot whether the game actually registers that a zip can be done or not, and sometimes a hazard will fall on Spider-Man's head and you have to dodge out of the way.
Easy as...
Okay, there was supposed to be a button prompt there. Guys, the game broke and I'm stuck in a tiny box of invisible walls. The tutorial glitched itself unwinnable. That or I've fallen prey to Spider-Man's newest villain, Mr. Mime! Pretty soon, Spider-Man comes across a truck with a shockwave generator, and you have to chase the truck through the city. No problem, I'll just climb over the top of this building and I'll have that truck in what the hell? So, not only am I stuck, but the city has disintegrated. Guess Pete didn't stop that reactor at the start after all. Okay, no problem. The direction arrow is pointing down this tunnel, so I'll just crawl through this gap. I said I'll just crawl through this gap. Mr. Mime, you nefarious fiend! Turns out literally the only way to chase after the truck is to climb over this one really specific building, because every other conceivable path leading out of the starting area is sealed off with invisible walls. This is the dirty little secret of the PC release. Despite how hard it tries to appear otherwise, this is not an open world like its console brethren. It's a strictly linear game. You'll regularly be tossed out into a city map that looks like an open world, but everything will be impassable except for the path to the next indoor mission. There's absolutely nowhere to go in the city bits except straight to the next story objective. And now you have context for how woefully pointless the web swinging truly is, because there's nowhere to go. Not only is the swing system insanely restrictive, but you don't use it to explore a big map or traverse intricate environments. It's just a brief, barely interactive commute between levels, a glorified playable loading screen. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with having a linear Spider-Man game. Spider-Man and Spider-Man both took a regular level-based layout, and they're perfectly fine games. Although Spider-Man had some annoying stealth levels and Spider-Man had a bitch of a final boss, Spider-Man even had brief city segments where Spider-Man would get chased over rooftops, while Spider-Man had city levels where Spider-Man would have big open aerial battles. Point being, you don't need the groundbreaking console Spider-Man 2 for this PC version to look pathetic and lazy. The older 3D Spider-Man titles still use their city levels to at least try and do something cool. The armored truck we were chasing heads to the prison to break out the Rhino, and now we have some goons with combat! If you click on enemies while you're close to them, you'll throw punches that are almost always blocked. If you point and click at an enemy from far away, Spider-Man will web them up, which does literally nothing because the instant you land a hit, it just breaks them free. Pretty much the only good way to fight the enemies is to jump in the air and kick them in the face, like we're role-playing Batroc Zeliper. The combat is rock simple since every enemy drops health and nothing in the game damages you all that much. The only problem is the controls. If you don't keep the cursor tracked perfectly on the enemy that you're trying to beat up, and your cursor grazes across a wall in mid-combat, Spider-Man will web zip right next to an enemy, or worse, web zip clear across the map instead of landing attacks. See, this is why it's not as streamlined as you think to map 5 or 6 functions to one button. So if the game doesn't have any commands except move, jump, punch, and web zip, how do you have a boss fight against major supervillain the Rhino? Well, that's easy. He stuns himself by stepping on the ground, and then you can punch him. You defeat the Rhino by him being too stupid to walk. And check out this dopey running animation in this actual finished pre-rendered cutscene. Who the hell greenlit this? Once you defeat Rhino, he's picked up by Doc Ock and quite casually carried away across the rooftops because according to the hilariously cheap-looking profiles that appear before each boss fight, Ock's arms are so freaking strong that he can carry 8 brick shithouse rhinos one-handed, which I call perpetual bullshit. Also, I love how these profiles tell you that the bosses are weak to chemical weapons, like it's implying that Spider-Man should just start straight up poisoning all his villains to death. Next we cut rather abruptly to Peter and Aunt May at the bank, and I don't usually pick up on stuff like this, but the lip sync in this cutscene is dreadful.
Peter, thank you for taking time out of your school day to come to the bank with me.
It's my pleasure, Aunt May. I'll make some time to study later.
Is it too much to ask that the lips at least keep moving until they stop talking? Ock shows up to rob the place, so Spider-Man runs around the bank taking down thugs who've apparently never heard of hostages. This is pretty typical of the game's indoor stages. You run around beating up bad guys and finding civilians that open doors further into the level for you. These stages are almost nothing but the bare-bones basic combat. You know, the stuff they probably shouldn't have built huge chunks of the game around. You pretty much just walk through the basic enemies like paper, and guys with guns barely damage you. The only special enemy that you encounter is a big dude with armor who blocks more of your attacks, and the game kinda lets you glitch right through them. See, as you do combat, you fill an adrenaline meter that, once it's full, lets you one-shot kill a bunch of enemies in a row. And for some reason, almost every time I fight one of these armored dudes, something happens to where my adrenaline meter just shoots to full and I can insta-kill him. That can't be deliberate game design unless the game is so allergic to actual difficulty that the one stronger enemy type offs themselves. Talk about a Suicide Squad. And no, you can't save adrenaline meter for when you actually need it, because that would take actual game balancing and maybe using more buttons than just directional keys and the mouse. I mean, what do you think this is? A professional AAA game on a high-profile license by one of the world's biggest publishers, currently being sued by literal thousands for discrimination and bullying of a sexual nature? No. The only real problem with the indoor levels is the compass. You have this arrow at the top of the screen pointing you to your next objective, except it doesn't use any waypoints. It just points directly at your target, regardless of how many brick walls or sectioned off hallways are between you and the goal. So take the lame combat and throw on a side of wandering around in circles trying to figure out where the hell you're supposed to go. At the bottom of the bank, you have your first showdown with Doc Ock, one of Spider-Man's most devious and dangerous nemesis. First, you get into the vault by playing Simon. I'm not joking. The bank vault is locked with 6 sequences from a Simon game. And when you meet Ock face to face, he just gets his own tentacles stuck in the ground with every attack that he launches so that you can walk up and punch him in the face for free. Don't get me wrong, the fights with Ock in the console version aren't much more complex, but at least there you web Ock's tentacles down to the ground to stun him. You don't win because he's a dipshit. Oh, and Ock will also electrocute the entire vault unless you can shoot a switch to shut it off. Assuming, of course, that Spider-Man can puzzle out the difference between shoot the switch and web zip into an electrified wall and slam his face into a wall right next to the switch. Ock still gets away, and you have to save Aunt May by webbing down a getaway truck's wheels.
I'll have to catch up with Ock later. Can't let them take Aunt May.
Gotta love how little of a shit Peter seems to give about his surrogate mother figure. You shut your trash mouth. Next, we cut over to Peter and Mary Jane walking down a street when MJ's car was stolen and Pete goes after it. He discovers that the car was stolen by Puma? Credit for using the lesser-known villains. I have literally never heard of this guy. Apparently he's got super strength and agility and he wants to kill Spider-Man just to prove that he can. Makes me wonder if they wanted to use Kraven the Hunter, but then someone fired up an Xbox and realized they already had. And Puma is a real tricky bastard. He doesn't just stun himself so that you can hit him for free, no siree. You have to use a dodge move that the game never ever mentions to get him to stun himself so that you can hit him for free. And you fight him about a dozen times just to make sure that you got it.
Pooh, a man, he flies like a moron. Dun.
Eventually, he leads you to a construction yard that's a friggin' nightmare to get across. You have to shoot hoppers to dump liquid onto Puma, while dodging projectiles, and if you're even slightly off target, you web zip off and fall, and there's nothing to crawl to, and the zip arbitrarily doesn't work on any of the terrain down here, and there's just nothing to jump to. You're damn near stuck! It's like they specially rigged it so that the web zip only works when you don't want it to. Even as far back as Spider-Man on the Nintendo 64, basic maneuvers like this were never a problem. This isn't just bad design, it's a total regression from 2 games that didn't have these issues. It turns out that Puma was hired by Doc Ock to lure Spider-Man away so that Ock could kidnap Mary Jane, which I've only been playing for 45 minutes, and we're already setting up the climax? Anybody want to go over/under on this and place your bets right now on how long this game will turn out to be? Because my spidey sense is saying, not very. Spider-Man's quest for Mary Jane is interrupted by Ock breaking into Oscorp, so you start the old run around beating people up to unlock new doors routine until Ock sets up bombs throughout the building. You're told the timers are already counting down, which is why no timers ever pop up the entire level. And how does criminal mastermind Doc Ock rig up his explosives? With more games of Simon! One of them plays hot cross buns. Aside from that, though, it's just more of the same remedial combat against more of the same basic enemies. Oscorp has a few turrets and laser tripwires to avoid, but they barely deal any damage. Lucky for me, because the controls are so finicky that avoiding obstacles barely works. It doesn't even look like Ock steals anything from Oscorp, nor does he meet with Harry like in the movie. All he does is make a phone call and leave. It's like he's got a really shitty cell phone and he just needed the tower's improved reception or something. Ock sicks the Rhino on you, and I'm just getting the biggest sense of deja vu here. Fighting the Rhino by jumping so that he crashes himself into electric pillars. This is a direct copy-paste of the Rhino battle from Spider-Man on the Nintendo 64. Right down to, I'm pretty sure they recycled the animation where he rears up to charge at you. So they did play the old Spider-Man game. They just didn't actually learn any game design from it. Spider-Man tries to chase Ock again, but this time he's stopped by Mysterio, who's used his illusion tech to transform the city into a floating void. What follows is about a 40-minute stretch of guess where the one swing point that leads further into the level is hidden, because crap on toast does the web zip not work worth a damn on anything in this level. You know, if the web zip isn't going to work about 80% of the time and is going to royally screw you a further 10%, why bother having it in the first place? But at least we finally get some different enemies, Mysterio robots, which are still weak as hell and, in fact, glitch out and explode if you stand where they're trying to spawn. You're in my way, sir. Eventually, you need to destroy some turrets by hucking a rock near them to draw their fire, then walking behind them and webbing the backs of the guns so that they overheat and explode. If you're not entirely sure how you're supposed to figure that out, the game brings up a screen giving you directions to get past the turrets. Except if you have the sheer nerve to actually be playing the game when this screen pops up, pushing or clicking any button closes it instantly. I did not edit that. I had to kill myself to get a second look at that screen and figure out how the hell you get past. You fight Mysterio by throwing rocks at him. The rocks keep spontaneously exploding for no apparent reason. You can't move while holding them. The rock blocks your view so that you can't aim worth a damn. The rocks just kind of float against the level terrain, and Spider-Man can barely hug these rocks any kind of distance. This mechanic is such hot garbage that Mysterio has to float in place completely still for minutes at a time in order for this fight to function. And of course, Mysterio was just hired by Doc Ock to distract Spider-Man even more. So it's nice to know that this level was a complete waste of time both in-universe and out. Speaking of wastes of time, you can find little mini-games scattered throughout the levels. You'll come across something like a soda machine that you can web yank, and then you're challenged to grab several tokens before a time limit runs out. Except, near as I can tell, tracking down and completing these activities doesn't actually do anything. Literally, at least some of them you can do multiple times because the level doesn't even mark them as being complete. You go to the train station, you fight a really big dog pile of mooks that you still just kind of blaze through because they all drop health. You chase Ock through an electrified sewer where the web zip constantly fails and climbing the walls gets you shot by turrets. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to beat this part other than just jumping into the electrified water and tanking the damage because the whole stage is broken. Again, sharp contrast to the last two games' sewer levels, which, wow, Spider-Man rolls around in shit an awful lot, doesn't he? And then we have the big epic train battle with Doc Ock, shooting at a bunch of random crap that he throws at you until Ock just kind of gets bored and leaves. Great, now they're stealing boss fights from that piss-awful Spider-Man DOS game. Oh boy, we're up to the scene from the movie where Spider-Man stops a runaway train with the crucified hero shot, invoking the symbolism of a man laying down his life for others. It's got to be the most iconic scene in the movie. In the console version, they had limited time and tech, so Spider-Man just pulls the rear of the train until it stops, but it carries the same point across, willing to save other people at the cost of his own life. Now let's see how the PC game handles this legendary sequence! The train starts derailing, and Spider-Man just jumps off and lets the train crash and explode in the middle of a city. You could not have missed the point of this scene any harder if you tried. This is like if Zack Snyder directed this scene of the movie. This Spider-Man don't give a shit! So of course you come to the docks to stop Doc Ock from turning his fusion reactor back on. Why exactly is Ock building this reactor to blow up the city? Who knows? You'll need to have watched the movie to have any context for what in the hell is going on, because this game hacked out just about every single scrap of the movie's plot, characters, and motivations. Peter's personal drama that's always been the core of the character? Gone. Peter's rocky relationship with Mary Jane that's tearing him apart from the inside? Gone. Otto's spiral into madness and villainy fueled by grief at the death of his wife, driven by ego and guilt to prove that he wasn't responsible? Gone. Harry descending into madness? Harry's not even mentioned in this game. He just happens to be in the opening cutscene that was plundered from the console version where he's an actual character. Nothing friggin' happens in this game except good guy and spider jammies fight bad guy who subcontracted other bad guys, with no drama, tension, or actual characters. This last level feels so barely functional that you can just about see the duct tape that's only just holding it together. You have to cross a few rooms where absolutely nothing is climbable or web zippable except for one really specific pillar. A few times I fell into a pit of electrified floors and could not jump back out anywhere. You come across what really might as well be the final boss, 4 of the buff goons clumped together. Oh, I'm sorry, make that 5 because another one popped up after I died. You're supposed to dodge their shockwaves and then attack while they're stunned, except I swear the game will deliberately rig your punches to aim at literally anything except the guy who's stunned, and I think they all phalanx together to block all of your attacks, unless you exploit a hitherto unknown weakness to doorways where they're forced to march at you single file. And the final battle with Ock is just pathetic. The idea of this boss is that you swing around this cluttered-ass, barely functional arena dodging barrels until you get a clear shot at some glowing blue weak points, shoot them, and Ock becomes vulnerable. Except you can just web zip straight to said weak point and punch it out while Ock consistently fails to hit a target 6 feet in front of his face. You basically just walk up to the final boss and kill him. Literally the only reason I died on this fight is because the boss glitched out and Ock stopped growing vulnerable to attacks. He just became flat-ass invincible by a game bug. The final boss has got to be the easiest battle in the game because the programmers have completely given up. You beat Ock, and once he realizes that his reactor really is busted, he sacrifices himself to save everyone, which frankly seems out of character given how one-dimensional mustache-twirling evil the game portrays him, and the game ends. At least you get this kick-ass cover of the Spider-Man theme by the Distillers to close out this awful game. Anybody who entered in a guess how long this game would turn out to be, dig out your answers because 2.5 hours! That's how long the game is. Barely any longer than the movie, and that's with me fumbling around some levels trying to figure out where to go. And given the utterly sad state of the final level, it feels like they just barely managed to finish what little is here. You do unlock a free play mode once you finish the game. You wander around 3 small chunks of city map doing absolutely nothing. I found a few remedial obstacle courses where nothing happens when you finish them. Playing for 15 minutes, I stumbled across all of one crime where I beat up a mugger and returned some lady's purse, only again for all of jack shit to happen. There's a little side quest going through the levels where you can find escaped convicts or exotic spiders, with several hidden in the overworld, but again, this side quest doesn't seem to do friggin' anything. And since you can't revisit levels, they're pretty much impossible to complete anyway unless you start the game over from scratch. Oh look, one of the criminals is hiding behind the Activision logo, being actively shielded by the company. Life imitates art, don't it? I think we're done here. Spider-Man 2 on PC feels like an insanely rushed and slapdash game. Total shovelware that was forced out to add on to the veritable mountain of game adaptations the movie received to milk as much cash out of it as possible. When you're even making adaptations for the Hyperscan, you know all shits given have left the building. Between the simplistic gameplay mechanics, the easiness of the campaign, and the fact that all the bad guys seem to be carrying water guns, I'm guessing I'll hear the argument that this version of the game was intended for really little kids, except it's not marketed that way. It's advertised exactly the same as the console version, not as Spider-Man 2 Junior Edition, but even if it were, I played Spider-Man on the Nintendo 64 when I was a little kid, the first movie licensed game when I was not much older, and they still mostly hold up as well-crafted experiences for all ages, because making something for kids is not and has never been an excuse to churn out crap. As for the fizz factor, well, they went silent for a few years after this game's release, up until they vomited out 4 licensed games in less than a year onto the Nintendo DS, immediately before closing forever in 2009. So Spider-Man 2 PC is probably the game the studio is most known for by a pretty wide margin, and well, this is one sad legacy.
Hey, did you get a charge out of that?